All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ridge Vineyard's weekly Winemakers Roundtable. Thanks for joining us today. My name is David Amadi. I'm the president of Ridge, and I'll be hosting today's tasting. So a couple of housekeeping points before we get going. If you have any questions for our production team, please use the Q&A function and pass those through. We love the questions. Keep them coming. We'll try to answer as many of those questions live as possible. We'll also have a team of Ridge folks watching the Q&A, so we'll be answering some of those questions in writing as they come through as well, but we'll answer as many live as possible. The chat function, feel free to use that, check in, tell us what you're drinking, where you're at, what's going on, say hi to folks, so feel free to use the chat function as well. So today's topic is older Montebellos or aged Montebello from our library, and we'll be tasting 3 vintages today. And we're going to do it from oldest to youngest. So the first wine we'll taste will be the 1990 Montebello, then the 2001, and then the third will be the 2002 Montebello. So when conducting a vertical tasting of Montebello, or for that matter of any wine, there's going to be some things that are consistent. So that all these wines are from the same site, the same vineyard, same terroir. The other consistencies are their varieties. Now the blends are going to change a little bit vintage to vintage, but these are all Bordeaux blends, Cabernet dominated wines. And then thirdly, the thing that is consistent is really the winemaking. The pre-industrial techniques that we use are consistent through the wines. But then what are the variables? So the variables are going to be the vintage. You know, was it hot? Was it cold? Was it dry? Was it wet? Was it an early harvest? Was it a late harvest? And how all those things impacted the wine. And then the third variable is the age. How long has it been in bottle and how's the wine evolved? So those will be the different variables that we consider as we taste and talk about these wines. So today we're tasting wines in half bottles. I'm not going to go into the impact of that. We'll talk to our winemaking crew about how bottle size impacts the aging of wine as we go through the tasting. But first I want to introduce our panel. So first in my Brady Bunch setup anyway, directly below me is Paul Draper, who's our chairman of the board and has been with Ridge since 1969. Paul's not been able to join all these tastings, so we're excited he's able to join us today. Thanks for coming on board, Paul. Directly in my upper left-hand corner is David Gage. David is our Senior Vice President of Vineyard Operations and has been with Ridge since 1989. And in the upper right-hand corner is John Olney. John is our COO and Lytton Springs winemaker. And John has been with Ridge since 1996. And in the lower left-hand corner is Eric Baher. He's our Montebello winemaker and Chief Operating Officer of the Montebello Winery. And Eric has been with Ridge since 1994. So thanks to the whole crew for joining us today and looking forward to an interesting tasting. So let's kick it off with the 1990 and Age Before Beauty. We're going to follow that theme. So Paul, we're going to let you kick it off, right?
Yes, given that I was the only one around and I was making this wine. Yeah. Incredibly fine winter, everything went well. Spring cut us back with some really difficult wind and rain in May, and so it pulled the crop down and gave us some a great deal of intensity. We could see really from the beginning as it was fermenting. The problem was that by August, the water in the root zone was really getting running low, and the vines began to be stressed. And part of that reason that they was the crop was so low. So it really, we saw that sugars were developing ahead of flavor, something we do not like to see. But we decided that we really would wait and make sure that we got full flavor, which we did. And the structure was phenomenal. Really firm tannins. And of course, one reason I'm here is that I wanted to taste this 90 again because it was an interesting vintage it showed so beautifully as a young wine, and yet it was one of those vintages that people talk about where as it developed, there would be times when it was showing beautifully, and then it would go into, I guess we could call it a slump. And I'd be doing tastings, and it would not be showing anywhere near what it initially had. But here we are 30 years later in half bottle, and it is, we've opened one earlier, and then what we've all just opened now. And I hope it's true for everybody out there that has the wine. It is amazingly beautifully structured. David was just saying it was his favorite of all the vintages. It's for a half bottle at 30 years of age. The 92 did that. Several other vintages have done that, but this is a great example. And the fact is that even though it's going to go longer in this bottle, it's something that people should have in their hands and be tasting because it is so beautiful. Anyway, my comments.
Yeah. So Paul, quick question, tasting the wine right now. People are asking about decanting of this wine and the other two wines. Do you think that people in a half bottle with the wine of this age should decant or straight out of the bottle?
In this case, as structured, as beautifully structured as it's showing, what I did was once opened, and I just had mentioned earlier that my little, 3/4, whatever it is, no, it's more than that, cork is only soaked through a quarter of the way. I mean, that cork was just perfect. Eric commented that those were the days when, without incredible selection that we have to do now, you could get corks of this quality. In any case, no. Once opened, I would say carefully, having had it standing up so you don't mix the sediment back in. Pour it off, pour it around carefully, set it back down, and don't disturb the sediment because it doesn't. I mean, it's so fresh, and it'll stay fresh longer if you don't decant. The other two, clearly, as we always recommend, I would say I think we're still talking with 01 and 02 of possibly double decanting. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely would benefit from that. I think they would open up a lot more. I know in a fifth, for sure, double decant is essential if you're going to drink the 2001 and 2002. The splits are a little bit more advanced, but there's still some pronounced tannin structure there.
Sure.
Yeah, the 90 definitely wouldn't need it at all. And when I opened it last week, I just poured it carefully out of the bottle direct to the glass, tasted it. It opened up in the glass, and then I kept tasting it throughout the day, and it just got better just sitting there. Yeah, it was really beautiful evolution.
Yeah. So David Gates, this was your second vintage at Ridge in 1990. First question, did you have any idea that the 1990s were going to be the decade that it was? I mean, was this the string of beautiful vintages, or were you just lucky? And two, talk a little bit about the terroir at Montebello that we're going to be tasting in all the wines that we have in front of us today.
Yeah, so the answer to number one is lucky.
Yes.
And the Montebello, we've talked off and on these webinars about Montebello, and what really makes it unique is that it's as geologists say, a foreign exotic terrain. So it's not from around here. It's actually was formed on the Farallon plate and is actually was part of that and was subsumed or was stuck onto the North American plate from the Pacific plate, pushing it under. And as you can see on this little map, the San Andreas Fault is where those two plates meet. And so Montebello is this piece of limestone and greenstone that was stuck on kind of on the edge of the North American plate, and then was lifted up from the seismic pressure and then eroded away. And so why we like that, why it's so unique is that we have this really old limestone. Like geological terms, it's say 4 times as old, 3 times as old as the limestone in California that we see around Paso Robles. Very old, and that means that it's very weathered. We like limestone because it keeps the soil sweet for vineyards. It allows for grapes, it gives them good access to nutrients, and being on a hill, on a mountain, we don't have a lot of nutrients for them. So it's important that the soil stays sweet for them. And that's the other thing that is unique about Montebello is where it's situated in California. So we're in the Santa Cruz Mountains. You know, we're not North Coast, we're not Central Coast, we're Santa Cruz Mountains. We face the bay, and that's another unique aspect of the Santa Cruz Mountains AVA. There's kind of, it's almost kind of bisected by the San Andreas Fault, and the vineyards, those vineyards that face the ocean, they're very hard to find areas in that section that grows, you know, really good Cabernet or Merlot. Facing the bay, with the diurnal curve or the fog that sets in from the bay, that really gives us it cools us down at night, and there's some fog, and yet it moderates the temperature. So actually, when we're above the fog layer, we're warmer at night than down in the valley, and then the valley heats up during the day, and then that fog kind of lifts up, the temperatures of that fog lift up and keeps us cooler during the day. So it flattens the diurnal curve, and that's what allows us to get Cabernet right. And as you taste this 1990, you can tell that it's you know, Cabernet that's grown in a really cool climate. There's olive on it, which for this wine, for me, when it was young, it showed a lot of green olive, and again, as Paul said, beautiful tannins. As it got older, sometimes you'd lose that a little bit. Sometimes you'd gain it back. And right now, as it sits in the glass, to me, it's showing really nicely. And that's one of the little check marks for Montebello that you often get.
So Dave,
I'm sorry, go ahead,
if
Paul.
I could add to your comment about the plates, it's always interested me that we were formed on that Farallon plate, but it was over where today Indonesia is, and it came all the way across over thousands of years to intersect or to be subsumed by the North American plate. So it really is exotic terrain.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to think about that because it moves so slowly, you know. It's like
Yeah.
this much a year, even. But
Like
I guess it adds
126
up.
million years, I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
so eventually Hawaii will be where Japan is, or something like that.
Well, we gave David, I'll give him a bad time because David, you had joined us just 2 years before.
Yes.
And you had come from Napa where yields were so much greater that I was from the beginning really worried that you were going to prune too long and never get the grapes ripe by winter. And you learned very quickly, but even in 90, I was still nervous. And of course, the weather thinned us out as well. But you learned quickly and have done such a great job.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I didn't have to worry about 90. That, like you say, Mother Nature did the job for us. That's for sure.
So John, let's bring you in the conversation. We've sort of referred to the half bottle and its impact on ageability, but why don't we talk a little bit about what that is and how a half bottle ages versus a 750 or a Magnum or even a larger format. And also people are asking about, you know, recommendations for storage within their homes. In, you know, if they live in a city, what would the recommendations be if you're starting a cellar?
Sure. So, you know, obviously, when you're looking at a half bottle, it's generally the smallest bottle that most people bottle, certainly is for us. So, you know, when you think about the fact that it's the interchange of oxygen that really makes a wine mature, because you have essentially less wine and yet the same opening at the top, you're going to have more interaction. You're going to have more contact with oxygen than you would in a 750 or certainly in a Magnum. So you can expect half bottles to mature a little more quickly. I find it varies a little more than people, think. I mean, for example, we're having the 90 right now, which I think is showing beautifully. So, it's really difficult to imagine this is a 30-year-old wine. So, it's certainly no reason not to have half bottles around. But, and then as far as storing, really temperature is the most crucial. So wherever you can find a cool spot, ideally it's going to be somewhere around 60. But choosing the coolest spots and place that's dark is really, that's the thing to focus on.
So David and Paul, since you were both there at the time, somebody was asking to compare the 90 to the 91, which was one of those super vintages. How would you compare the two?
I'll say a few words first because I mentioned it earlier to Eric. Here is a vintage where it went through this thing that virtually doesn't happen to us now at Montebello. And I think whether it's refining our techniques as we've gone forward, but that is what I said earlier, that it went into these dumb periods and then came out, went into them again, and 91 from the beginning just held that level of accessibility, and it was totally together, showing what it was. So in that sense, a real contrast. Now there are other differences which have to do with structure. Eric, why don't you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the 91, I've always found it to just be like so perfectly balanced. The tannin fruit intensity really carries the tannins well. 90, I recall when I first joined here, drinking it as a young wine, it was much more angular, very chalky, dark, rich fruit, high acid. Its tannins kind of needed more time to settle in the bottle. And I've seen it go through those waves as it's aged, and, periods of time when the fruit to tannin ratio was a little bit kind of in a slump. But today, I mean, it's just perfect. I mean, the tannins are just really at that point of perfect resolution. The fruit's still there. It's kind of what we'd love to see every Montebello kind of age out to.
Right.
It reminds 91, me. Yeah, 91 just drinks so well. I mean, at every point I've ever tasted that wine, I mean, it's always been perfect.
Yeah,
and I was thinking about that this wine needed time. I mean,
yeah.
I haven't had a fifth either recently, but given this half bottle, it was, 74 was very much that way. It really initially was not that enjoyable. I mean, the nose was beautiful, but it just was too structured, and it took years for it to really come around to be one of the great vintages of the 70s.
Yeah, no, it required patience. A lot of the Montebellos require patience. It's just, I mean, the great thing about the half bottles and why I love to have them in my cellar at home is that I can drink the vintage early and kind of get an idea for how it's aging out. So then I can know when I want to begin opening up fifths and certainly magnums much later on.
Well, Eric, I don't know if you'd agree, but my feeling is that as we went into the 90s, beyond this vintage, we really achieved a balance where you could approach the wine as a young wine and really enjoy it. I mean, yes, you're going to get so much more complexity if you wait, but at least you didn't have this level of tannin that was just off-putting the way it was initially in the 90 and say in the 74 and a number of other vintages. So I think just perfecting the techniques and narrowing the window on picking, all of that gave us wines which do show well as young wines.
Yeah, and I think also part of that equation is David Gates and farming. I mean, having more time here as we got into the 90s. Also, the climate slightly different as we've gone through the years. The tannin quality has just gotten finer. You know, we're able to get out of the fermenters wine that's so much more balanced from the start that you can actually assemble a Montebello. And like the 19 that I have right here, I mean, it's delicious. Its tannins are so incorporated and integrated with the fruit that it's a wonderful wine. I mean, I'm just drawn towards enjoying Montebello when it's got a lot more bottle age on it. But yeah, we definitely are making Montebellos today that really can be enjoyed at all points of its life.
You mentioned the finer tannins, and I'm just remembering that it was really just after this vintage that we went from a form of pumping over that was very gentle, but we continued it longer, and it was not as subtle as the very gentle pump overs that we do today. And I think maybe that extraction has become more subtle and therefore given us those fine tannins.
And also, I think we brought, well, like when I joined, I mean, we brought a bunch of new fermenters that were even smaller, you know, 1 ton and 3 ton.
Sure.
You know, before that, we were kind of in 5 ton fermenters, and they extract differently. So as we've gone into the smaller tanks, they just seem to give us better color and tannin extraction. It leads to much more of those supple tannins.
And you know, most people think smaller fermenters are essential only for Pinot Noir. We found that they're also essential for the finest Bordeaux varieties.
Yeah, especially here at Montebello, where we have these old vines, low yield, small plots. I mean, you can't take an old vine parcel that's giving you 2 tons off of, you know, 5 acres and fit it into a 5-ton tank. So now today with the smaller tanks, we could keep everything in the vineyard as separate as possible, you know, and work each tank carefully. And today, I mean, we're tasting fermenters 5 times throughout the day as it's extracting and really deciding, you know, how much more pump over to give, how much time. Do we do the afternoon pump over, or do we cut off? And I mean, we're really in tune with the extraction to come out of the fermenter with the wine that has the adequate structure for long-term aging, but we also want the finest quality tannins that generally come off in the early part of the fermentation.
So Paul, I have a question here, and before we move to the next one, I thought it'd be an interesting one for you, because sometimes or oftentimes in the millennium of wine, serendipity can play a role in things. But the question is about, and maybe it applies to Peroni, but it also applies to the SRI scientists who refounded Ridge. When they found their property, how did they know what they had? I guess is the question. Or how were they able to identify such a unique property?
They didn't know, and it was interesting to them. They bought the property with the idea that, one, they could bring their kids up to the country on weekends and camp out and spend time. And then when they finally retired from SRI, the idea was that they would all build homes up here and be able to live up in the hills rather than down in Menlo Park and Palo Alto and that area. And they liked the idea that there were these 8 acres of Cabernet and a few more acres of Chardonnay that had been replanted in 49. They liked that idea, but it was not important to them. And if it had not been for Dave Benyon in 59, keeping back a small amount of the Cabernet and making what ended up being a half barrel of Cabernet. He had never made wine before, as the others had not. He just did the most simple approach, and in fact, used this old French technique of submerged cap that would allow him to go to work during the week, because he would be a home and could oversee the wine only on weekends. So by submerging the cap, it would continue to ferment, but not acidify, not develop volatile acidity and go toward vinegar. So he made this half barrel. He showed it to, of course, his partners, but then he also showed it to friends who were fine wine collectors. And they said, oh my God, you guys have got to do something with these grapes. You've got to reopen that old winery. And so that's what led them by 62 to have gotten rebonded and be able to put out their first commercial vintage in 62. But they didn't really have any idea of what they had. I should say this, though, that as scientists, for them, a book became very important called High Tech, High Touch. Here they were out there on that virtual curve that was going so far and so fast. And what they realized was the more they were in that virtual world, the more they needed their feet on the ground. They needed to contact what? The earth, the seasons. And for them, the vineyard was that. And so from the beginning, no irrigation except for young vines, replants for the first, 8 years, and then no more irrigation. Cover cropping from the beginning, use of natural yeast, allowing the natural malolactic, no fining even, no filtration. And so that was, they couldn't have been more traditional without, in a sense, really knowing much about tradition. Yeah. And yet that's what they did. And it's what informed what one reason they were interested in having me join as winemaker was that was my philosophy. And it really is due to them that we began this tradition that we follow today.
So there was a bit of serendipity to the story, that they didn't really understand what they were buying when they bought it, and only over time and through the making of the wine that was it really uncovered, really. Right,
yeah. And maybe I should mention that they already knew, because they had already brought in two other partners, the three original guys, and both of them actually three partners. Two of them were fine wine collectors and very knowledgeable. So they were already getting an idea of it. But when they offered me the job, they opened the 62 and the 64. And I had been tasting, outside of great Inglenook's from the 30s and La Cuesta from Woodside in the 30s that were made traditionally, I'd been tasting all these great first growths. And I tasted that 62 and that 64, and I had not seen in the 40s, 50s, and so far in the 60s any California wines of that character, quality, complexity, and ability to age. And I said, very selfishly, I said, not only do I like these guys and their families, but if I join them, I'm going to have a chance to make some really fine wines, because they have got an unusual sight.
And if I could add one other thing, is that they had the site. Paul saw the potential, and other people saw the potential, but they also stayed true to keeping Montebello separate. They didn't, blend it with 1 million gallons of Valley grapes to make the Montebello brand, right? That has happened over and over in the California wine business, and thankfully did not happen to this little slice of paradise up here.
That's right.
Yeah, the idea of single vineyard wines, of seeing that individual character, was something they believed in from the beginning.
Well, good. Well, we could sit here and chat all day, but we need to get to the second wine.
I know.
We've got to move on.
Yeah. And so, Eric, I'll ask you to kick it off on the 2001. This is a really unique and different vintage.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything about it is so different. I mean, the vineyard had evolved from the beginning. It was just Cabernet Sauvignon. Then the first parcel of Merlot planted just above me was planted in the late 60s, and that started to come into the Montebello around 74 vintage. And then gradually the Franc was put into the ground, then Petit Verdot in the late 80s. So by 2001, then we had more parcels of Merlot, you know, several parcels of Petit Verdot and Franc. And in this vintage, I mean, as we assemble every vintage, the tastings are done blind. What really stood out as just superb quality was the Merlot parcels. So in 2001, it's the vintage that we added the largest amount of Merlot in any vintage of Montebello, 36%. And then the Petit Verdot is 8%. And sadly, the Franc that year, with it being so dry and that block of Franc being so difficult to ripen, it just didn't really do it for us. So in the blind tasting, we kept the Franc out. But with that much Merlot, it just really gave this 2001 Montebello an opulence and just this gorgeous weight on the palate. It's aged really well. Yeah, it's just got so much intensity of flavor and those really beautiful tannins that you get from the addition of Merlot, which in Montebello, I mean, being mountain grown on limestone, the Merlot here in a blind tasting, especially in that vintage, the Merlots actually felt as big and rich and as serious as the best of the Cabernets. And that's how we ended up with that much coming into the blend. Because when we're assembling, everything is blind. We randomize the flights, so we're tasting Cab against Merlot and Petit Verdot, and it's more just, does that particular glass that represents part of the vineyard, does it have the Montebello character? And in 2001, so many of the Merlots did, and we brought it all together and made this beautiful Montebello. It's our 40th anniversary bottling as well. And you can see the label has also changed over time. So you look at the 90, we called it the Ridge Santa Cruz Mountains Montebello. Then we went to California. And then today it just simply reads Ridge Montebello. And, you know, we continue to plant. I mean, part of what David's been busy over the last several years is taking some of the old abandoned land that was part of Perone's original wine operation, and it's been gradually restoring some of that back to vineyard. And we're going to be planting more Cab. We've got more Merlot going into the ground this year. So the hope is, you know, planting in really what is some of the most optimal real estate on Montebello. You know, we'll have more to work with in the future to just continue making, you know, larger amounts of Montebello, hopefully. I mean, we plant today, but we never really know until the vines are under production. We bring the fruit in, ferment it, and just see what we get. But really, with where we're planting today at this elevation, and really in some of the most eroded soils where the limestone is really present, we should really get some amazing quality in the future from these blocks.
And of course, we don't know. It's never going to be a lot, because
no. I mean, we don't get the yields. Yeah.
We talk about planting, and it's a 10-acre parcel is huge. And then the next one that we're working on, David, I think is about 7. And you know, we're reaching our limit. But so Montebello is always going to be not a large quantity of wine, but that's what is, to us, is amazing to have these new areas, old areas, opened up again.
Yeah, and I think also climatically on the mountain, this is kind of being up at 2,400 feet and higher. I mean, this is really the spot that's probably the most protected from climate change effects. I mean, they're going to receive so much more of the ocean effect to ensure good acidity and management, kind of moderating the ripening of the grapes, which we really count on, because Montebello is something that we really always want to continue to produce at less than 14% alcohol, ideally 13.0 and even under if we can get to it. So being higher up the mountain with the best ocean exposure for the diurnal effect, the ocean cooling effect, it's really going to help with slowing ripening, getting flavor before the sugar, and give us fruit that we can really turn into beautiful wine at the lower alcohol points.
And it's great that you mentioned that, because the other shock was
Ah,
when we
yeah.
when we when we made the first assemblage of the Montebello 2001 for the first and only time in our 60-year history. It was just barely over 14, and we were
Yeah.
both just amazed.
Ah,
And,
I
and we
know.
said, well,
14 too.
oh God, but look how beautiful it is. It was, I
It is.
think, that Merlot that ripened earlier and was just a little more ripe than the Cabernet would have been at the same point of time.
Yes. It was a dry year, so we didn't really have the water in the ground. The
Right.
vines weren't developing flavor because we go through and we sample grapes before we harvest, and as long as there's a really strong green flavor, we delay picking until that moment when the grapes finally move out of green and just too ripe. And in 2001, it took going longer on the vine, more days, slightly higher sugar levels than what we would want, but that was really due to the water stress on the vines.
So John, from your perspective, tasting this wine, what do you think the Merlot and the Petit Verdot are bringing to the blend? How are they complementing the Cabernet?
Well, I think, no question, I remember 2001 being, unique in the sense that, it really surprised us, the ripeness. And I think one of the things you see, what stands out, for me in the wine is on the middle of the palate, there's this sort of lushness and there's a real fat kind of middle to it, which is what I think is I think what we're seeing there is Merlot that's a little riper than we usually get it, and so yeah, that's kind of how I see the wine. And I think the ripeness also brings out a little bit more of that varietal character, so I think that's one of the reasons for me. It's still, the 01 still has some primary fruit to it. I mean, this is a very, very young wine. It's really incredible you really have to check yourself, both in the color and just the label to be sure you're, not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, I keep coming back to the wine for that reason. It's like it is a bit of an odd duck in a Merlot in a Montebello lineup because of that richness in the middle. It really is distinctive, but it's awesome. It's still beautiful. It's still Montebello, but it definitely has its own personality. Absolutely.
It's so polished on the nose too. Got lots of minerality and mint. Very polished.
So Paul, when you wrote this label and you said 20 years to full maturity, are you still holding by that?
Oh, no. we were, I mean, I'm sure people didn't think we were very modest when we said 20, but, we've now learned that typical Montebellos are out there at 30 and, depending on the vintage, out to 40 and 50. So we're not as modest as we used to be.
Yeah. Well, we had to sell the vintage too, get people to
yes.
change it.
We didn't want people to think they had to wait 20 or 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, but I remember, I was going to say about this vintage, I remember when it was first released, some of the press on it was what's going on at Ridge and Montebello. They were calling it the Merlotization of Montebello because of that 36% Merlot being added.
That's right.
Where we suddenly going more right bank than left bank.
So Eric, we have quite a few people that are chiming in who are new collector members and new to Montebello. So they're interested in the more recent vintages and what you think are maybe some of your favorites over the last 5 or 10 years. I know, I'm going to put you to the test.
It's a tough one. I mean, I'm kind of, well, I'd say, I mean, there's certain years, like, I'd say that kind of parallel Bordeaux to some extent, like the 9 and the 10, and 5, even though we're thousands of miles away from Bordeaux, it seems like we tend to line up more with what's going on over there. With those super vintages of Montebello, where they just have so much weight and intensity and really strong Montebello character. So the 5, the 9, the 10, as you come to more recent vintages, I'm also really impressed with the quality and richness of the 12 and the 13. You know, again, they just have these really intense, deep flavors with so much minerality. I mean, they're going to age forever. Like 12 and 13 both easily will go beyond 50 years with the tannin structure that they have. And then I've been, working on 19. I mean, this is also just a stunning wine. I mean, it's really sensuous and drinks extremely well right now. I mean, it's sad that we haven't been able to have anyone up to the winery to taste it for the Futures event, but I mean, it's so delicious. I mean, there's so much intensity there.
Yeah, the 2013 was certainly a lot of critical acclaim, sort of that vintage towards the middle of the drought years.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was just looking the other day at auction market and all that, and that seems to be the vintage that is fetching quite the price right now. So the 13 certainly is a one jumping out at people right now for sure.
Well, David, I think it was that in general in California, 13 was the top vintage of that era. And the interesting thing was, if you look at the critics, our 12 was considered by many the best 12. And we see it as different, of course, but right up there with the 13. So we were very fortunate in our area and with our approach to make a 12 that is standout.
Yeah. Well, it's because we had to pick it in 16 days in the 12 minutes. I mean, that was beginning of the drought, and with the shortage of water in the ground and then the heat during harvest, it was like we had to scramble. Luckily, we were done with Zen harvest, so we got the picking teams from up north, the North Bay, down to Montebello, joining the Montebello team, and 16 days we got it all off the vine. And it was a good thing because, I mean, it could have easily gone beyond the 14 that we had in the 01, and that was something we did not want to see.
Good. Well, let's move forward to the 2002, the next vintage. Maybe I'd say more of a typical Montebello vintage, a little bit more in the mainstream. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a vintage of the two. I mean, the vintages seem to kind of repeat on 10-year cycles. I see a lot of the 92 characteristics in this wine with the cool climate, theme of fruit, the forest notes. I mean, it's just so exotic. It's a spice box, and it's well structured. That was also a year, I mean, we got really good tannin extraction. And then we did this real special selection that year. I know we narrowed down the selection, probably the smallest Montebello that I've assembled since I've been at Ridge. I think it was just over 2,300 cases. So, really small, but really powerful and concentrated and well weighted for the aging potential that we have. I mean, it drinks so much younger than even the 2001.
It is interesting to try these two wines side by side. They have such really unique personality side by side, much more structure in the O2, leaner. It doesn't have that same fat middle. It's a little bit more classic Montebello. It's really a fascinating comparison side by side.
Yeah, and when you look at the varietal breakdown, I mean, it is more of what is a typical Montebello today. It's in the 74% cab range, 18 Merlot, 8 Petit Verdot. And again, sadly, the Franc didn't make it. I mean, it's just the drought persisted into 02, and it was just too much. But that was the year we actually bottled the Franc on its own and made a Cabernet Franc Montebello. Right. That was a real hit.
Right.
But, yeah, super small production 2002. We just didn't get the yields. The vines are really starting to feel the pressure of having 2 years of back-to-back drought.
Paul, in your notes, it talks about the fact that there was a lot of consideration of fining the wine, but after testing, you decided not to. So maybe you could elaborate on that and our basically our thoughts on fining.
Right. We had done some early fining, not of the whole lot, because we saw those tannins, but seeing that structure from the low yields and and really right up to the end, we were concerned that the tannins were not going to be in balance. But every time we tasted as the wine aged, it really was clear against, you know, very moderate fining. We preferred not fining, and we held that. And our approach has been for years, and certainly is now, with a very few exceptions, not to do the Bordeaux approach to fining when we're doing fining. They typically wait until the second winter, and before, you know, I don't know, 3-4 months at least before bottling, they will fine with 5 or 6 egg white. We found that we much prefer when the wines are young, when we're preparing for the, well, doing the first assemblage, really when the wines are what, four months or so old, we'll find among them some of the wines which we think are absolutely of Montebello quality, but the tannins are out of balance. And it may be none of the parcels, it may be 3 or 4 of them. And what we'll do is do trial finings on those. And usually you have to use, on a young wine, far more egg whites, fresh egg whites. But we do that and we find the level that we prefer. And those wines that are too tannic to make the first assemblage, we will then fine and we'll try again in the second assemblage. And almost always they'll go in at that time. And we much prefer that because it means that 90% or 85 or 99% of the wine is unfined. And of course, not sterile filtered in any case. But that really has been our approach, and we vastly prefer it.
So John, there's a question that was interesting about the use of Corvin and older wines. And I was curious of what your thoughts on that are, and if you've had success with that, or would you recommend that? John, I think you might be muted. I'm not hearing you on my side.
Yeah, I had some noise outside. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so on the Corvin, yeah, Corvin, I mean, really is, to me, you know, there's been lots. There's been the vacuum pump. There's been, you know, just sort of trying to put inert gas on it and then stuffing the cork in. But, you know, the fact that you're actually not opening the bottle, I think is a real game changer. And I've had success with Corvin. I know we use it in the tasting room with a lot of success. You see people using it in other tasting rooms, obviously, and, you know, in bars when they were open. So it's no, I think Corvin really is it's a neat technology.
So in terms of going back to the fining question for a second, because there was a question about that, is that if we fine, do we mention that on our ingredient label? So
it would be, yeah, it's one of the ingredients. So, I mean, it's rare today. I mean, I can't even, well, let's see, it predates even the ingredient labeling. I mean, it was the last time we find a Montebello or even a part of it. I mean, we're really so focused on tasting in the fermenter to never push the tannins that far out of balance to begin with. So really the only wine that gets any kind of small fining, and it's only done every few years, is the estate Cabernet. That's where maybe a really tannic lot would go rather than go into Montebello. We'll send it to the estate production, fine it first, and then put it in.
So in that rare occasion that we do find, what is the fining agent that we prefer, Eric?
It's fresh egg whites. So, you know, we'll do our trial, we'll taste, we'll see what level we like. We're usually doing a range, so from very low, medium to high. Mix up the flight so we're tasting everything, and then it's just going to be the group consensus. What's the best wine where the tannins have been softened enough, but we haven't sacrificed complexity and richness? And so whatever that level is, then that's what I'll place in order. Go down to the egg ranch, get the organic eggs fresh, bring them up. We'll then sit here and separate yolks and whites and stir in so many per barrel. And then make cannelé. No, my favorite.
Sabaglione.
Yeah.
So Eric, we had another question about the use of SO2 in Montebello, and do we use it, and generally, if we do, how much do we use during the winemaking process?
Well, we're very fortunate at Montebello have very acidic grapes. So acid is such a good preservative of wine. It helps with also the health of the fermentation. So we'll add just a small amount initially at crush. That helps select for Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the wine fermenting yeast. That's natural. That comes from the vineyard with the grapes. And then the next addition doesn't happen until we're past malolactic fermentation. So that may be December or January, where we'll stir in a small amount into the barrel and then do our assemblage tasting, rack the chosen barrels to the assemblage tank, make a small addition at that point. And then at every rack coming off the lee, as we get towards bottling, we'll make small additions. So if you total it all up from crush to bottle, we're generally somewhere between 50 to 70 parts per million total, which is extremely low. I mean, it's not much exposure. Now, if you look at the maximum legal limit that the government allows a winemaker to add to the wine, it's about 350. So we're staying on the very low side.
Okay.
But even more, David, interestingly enough, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but for the EU, for Europe, natural wine can add up to 100 parts, and we're below that. So in Europe, Montebellos would be natural wine. In America, they're not, because you cannot add effectively anything.
That's correct.
Yeah, in the U.S., it's forbidden. You cannot add even a single drop.
Yeah. So remember, when you look at a European natural wine, that is something that has been able to be made with using SO2, but keeping it in bounds. In America, nothing, no SO2 is allowed. It's really unfair.
And it's pretty difficult to do that. I mean, you can achieve it if you were just making a handful of barrels and you could just hover over them and really like do everything as completely sanitary, but it still can lead to off flavors in the wine. You get oxidation naturally just from, wine resting in barrel. You have oxygen moving through, interacting with the wine, and it can really send the wine off and veer off to different flavors that are really not characteristic of the vineyard site. So we'll always make these small additions just so that it helps keep the wine on that good path towards bottle, where the flavors are really showing off strongly the Montebello character, but keeping those levels low. And again, what allows us to do that is the high acidity that we have in the grapes. High acid allows the wine to really be well protected on its own.
Yeah, I think another factor too is with a wine like Montebello, there's so much color and tannin in there too, which are antioxidants, on their own, that allows us to really keep the sulfur levels low.
Yeah, I mean, another, along the point you were making, Paul, is that yes, you can, in Europe, you can make a wine with 100 parts per million sulfur and call it natural. Montebello is made from 100% organic grapes, but we can't call the wine organic because we use sulfur. To be an organic wine in the U.S., you cannot use sulfur at all. So there's no consistency from Europe to the U.S. to other parts of the world in terms of how things are described or labeled or regulated. So it is a little odd. Yes.
Right. And in Europe, an organic wine or a biodynamic wine are both called bio. Yeah. And so the Montebello in Europe is both bio and natural.
That's right.
And yet in America, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we actually have one more wine to taste, and that's the 2019 Montebello. It's a barrel sample from the first assemblage. I know, Eric, you've been working on a second assemblage.
Yeah.
Maybe this is it.
The first assemblage went so well. I mean, so much of it was put together. it was hard to imagine that you could perfect it any further. I mean, I still held out a couple lots that needed more time on their own, not so much because of the tannin structure. They were still just kind of at the tail end of finishing malolactic fermentation, and at the first assemblage just weren't really ready to taste. And so I've looked at those a couple times now with the rest of the team here, and it just doesn't look, I mean, in blind tasting, the winning wine, especially yesterday when we did it again blind with fresh palates, it was unanimous. The favorite glass was just the first assemblage. And so it's a really complete wine. It's a blend of 81 Cab, 10 Merlot, 8 Petit Verdot, and 1 Franc. And it's coming in at 13.5 alcohol. You know, it was a wet year. We had a lot of rainfall. So it's still pretty amazing to see that we were able to get to this intensity. The wine's got a real nice full body, deep color, really great intense fruit. I think it was just the magic of having summer be so dry and so warm that we were able to really get the vines, the water stress that we count on to really help keep the berries small and give us that concentration in the fermenter.
Yeah, David, maybe you want to talk about the 19 vintage. Must have been a bit of a challenge. We, got 65 inches of rain, which is a lot of rain on the vineyard, more than double normal. What else do you remember about the 19?
It's all a blur, David. No, it's the sad fact, or the fact of farming is you can't really, it's not like money management. You can't stretch things out. So I'd rather have a little bit more rain this year because we're only half of our average instead of having almost double our average the year before. So no, you deal with it. The good thing about the rains that happened in 19 is they were spaced like almost every third day it rained. So that's good because our soil drains really well. It was great for our aquifer. All of our wells recovered beautifully. The bay, the San Francisco Bay, has never looked better as last year. I think, well, and this year it's not looking so well, but that really helped. There's the solution to pollution is dilution. So having a big rain really does clean things up. We're very lucky because the early rains that started that winter were gentle. So our cover crop grew really well. So we didn't have a lot of erosion losses. And the season started out fairly normally, a little bit late. And despite the rains, the vines just kind of trooped along. And they did stop, which is a good thing. They stopped in May. We got a big rain in May. The last time we had a rain that large in May was in 1997. And our crop in 2019 was almost as large as our 1997 crop. Yeah. And so that really helped the vines just keep on growing. And the Cabernet had a large crop on them. And we were ahead of schedule a little bit. And so we just let it ride and lucked out with beautiful weather. The harvest was started a little bit, then we paused and then kept going. And again, we finished before November. Mm-hmm. So most of the Cabernet was picked in the month of October. That's pretty much normal for Montebello. Yeah. And knock on wood, it's been several years since we've gone into November harvesting, and this might be the year though because we're late.
Yeah, I know it is. Yeah, it's been cold up here.
Yeah. So Eric, I think the Merlot was the star of the 19. I mean, it was. It was all of it, but really a star, right?
Yeah, all of it's in, and it only adds up to 10%. It was the one variety that was out in bloom during those May storms. So sadly, the yields came down on Merlot, but it just produced such beautiful quality. And so we put every parcel, every drop in, and it just adds up to 10%. Same with Petit Verdot. I mean, it didn't get hit by rain during bloom. It just did so well, and we put every drop in, which gives it good color definition and the beautiful violet notes.
And Eric, going back to the first assemblage, that was the most amazing assemblage I can remember. And I think the only time when we went through glass after glass and were able to include it. I mean, usually we're rejected.
Without even knowing, remember?
Without it knowing. We didn't know
I
we
set
were
it up in like a really complicated assemblage just so that we didn't know what we were doing as we went from one flight to the next.
right.
Just so that we really kept it totally focused on, you know, I mean, we didn't want to know were we adding as we were continuing to taste the next flights forward.
Right.
So that we were really focused on what is the ultimate best quality blend of each flight.
Even though we taste and vote blind, and so it doesn't affect what we do, but we always sort of sit there and say, oh, we added something, thank God. And,
yeah.
and the way you set it up, even though we're doing exactly what we did blind, we're not adding anything, but we still think that way.
Yeah.
By doing it the way you set it up this year for the first time, we sit there and we have no idea until we finish that for the first time in our history, we went through and included every one of the lots that we were looking at for the first assemblage.
Yeah.
Wow. I know many of you out there are already collector members, but if you're not, this is an opportunity to join our collectors club and buy the 19 Montebello on via futures. You can get the wine now and it'll be delivered to you, or buy the wine now and it'll be delivered to you in about 2 years. And it's a great way to access Montebello at a lower price by being a member of collector. And because the 19 vintage is, you know, considerably larger than average, we do have the ability to add people to the club at this point, which is nice. Last year in 18, a lot of members didn't even get their wines because it was such a small vintage. So it's nice to be in the other position and be able to fulfill everybody's desires and also welcome some new people to the club. So if you're interested, please go to our website or call our main line and we'll give you all the details on that. Well, good. We're just over 5 o'clock, guys. So thanks for another great tasting. We really went by very quickly. It was a great discussion, and the wines were absolutely fantastic. So thanks for your time and your expertise. So thanks, David. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah,
thanks,
thank
John.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining, and most of all, thanks to our audience out there for joining today and participating in another Winemaker Roundtable. So hopefully we'll see you next Thursday, 4 p.m. Pacific time. All right. Be well, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.